In this section, we're going to discuss debt-to-income ratios. In the industry, they're commonly referred to as DTI. Debt-to-income ratios are used to evaluate the borrower's capacity or the ability to afford the mortgage for which you were trying to qualify them. There's two ratios that are commonly used, the front end and the back end, also called the primary and the secondary. Oftentimes with automated underwriting systems, only the back end is used. But when we're talking about underwriting guidelines, it's often you'll see something like ratio requirements of 28/36. That's a standard conventional ratio. That means that the front end ratio requirement is 28 and the back end requirement is 36. You may also see something like 31/43, which is the FHA requirement. That just means that the front end ratio requirement is 31 and the back end ratio requirement is 43. So let's talk about what we mean by front end and back end. The front end ratio includes all of the payments associated with the house, so the taxes, the insurance, the principal and interest, the mortgage insurance if applicable, and the HOA if applicable. You take the sum of all those numbers and you divide that by the monthly income, and that gives you the front end ratio. The back end ratio is that number for the housing payment that we just calculated, plus all the other borrower's obligations, such as car payments, utility payments are not included, credit card payments would be included. The math is not difficult. The most difficult part on the back end ratio is determining what numbers are included and what numbers are not included. Before we get into the details of what to include and what not to include, let's just do a few simple calculations. Okay, in our example here, we see that the house payment, and just for simplicity's sake, we're going to say that includes all the taxes, insurance, mortgage insurance, principal and interest, and everything else is $1,500. All the other debts that we are going to count, again, we're just going to simplify and say we're going to use all $500 of that. The monthly debts are $500, and the monthly income for the borrower is $4,500. So if we want to figure the front end ratio, we're just going to take the monthly payment and divide that by the monthly income. So it's a fairly easy math calculation. It's just $1,500 divided by $4,500. And when you do that on your calculator, you get an answer of 0.33. So the front end ratio is 33%. For the back end ratio, we take the $1,500, add that to the $500, and then divide that total by the $4,500. So when you add the $1,500 and the $500, that gives you $2,000. You're going to divide that by the $4,500, which is the monthly income. And that gives you a back-end debt ratio of 0.44. So their back-end ratio is 0.44 or 44%. So the debt-to-income ratios for this borrower, we can say that they are 33/44. 33 being the front-end ratio, and 44 being the back-end ratio. Now let's get into more detail about what numbers you actually use in the secondary or back-end debt ratio and which ones you don't. An overriding good principle to follow is if it's on the credit report, you need to use it. If it's not on the credit report, there's a very good chance that you do not need to include that in the back-end debt ratio. The only exception to that are payments like child support and alimony, for which a borrower is legally obligated. Those do need to be included in the back-end debt ratio. The things like electricity payments, for example, those do not need to be included. Cell phone payments, cable TV payments, those types of payments do not need to be included. One way to think about it, which doesn't always apply, is if the borrower stops paying that payment, what's going to happen? In the case of the utility payment, their lights are going to be shut off, but they don't have an ongoing debt. Whereas on a car payment, if they stop making their payment, then the bank's going to continue to want to make those payments made or have those payments made. So it doesn't always hold true, but it's a good rule of thumb to use. The easiest is the credit report. If it's on the credit report, you need to count it. If it's not, most likely you don't unless it's child support or alimony. So let's go through this list and talk about what things we do need to count and which ones we don't. Okay, principal and interest, obviously we need to include. Taxes. Those are referring to the property taxes, and so those will also need to be included. Insurance, we're referring to the homeowner's insurance, so that needs to be included. Car payment, $200, that's going to be on the credit report, so that needs to be included. Health insurance for $500, that's not going to be on the credit report. If the borrower stops paying that, then their health insurance will lapse, but they will not have an ongoing obligation, so we are not going to count health insurance. Cable TV, also not on the credit report. We're not going to count that in their debt ratios. Credit card payment, yes. Child support payment, yes. Electricity payment, no. So now let's calculate this borrower's primary or front end and secondary or back end debt ratio. Okay, for the front end, again, we need the entire house payment. So in this case, we have our principal and interest payment, which is $1,500. But remember, we need to use the entire house payment, so we need to add $200 for the taxes and the $50 for the insurance to make up their entire house payment. That gives us a total housing expense of $1,750. To get our front end debt ratio, we're going to divide that number by the $5,000 of their monthly income. And when you do that on your calculator, $1,750 divided by $5,000 or $5,000, that equals 0.35. So their front end debt ratio is 35%. Now for their back end debt ratio, you're going to take the $1,750 that we had as their housing expense, and we're going to add to that all their other payments. So they have a car payment of $200, they have a credit card payment of $150, and they have child support of $200. You're going to add those numbers up, and that's going to give you the borrower's total debt obligations that you're then going to be able to use for their back-end debt ratio. And when you add all those up, that gives you a total monthly payment obligation of $2,300. To figure out back-end debt ratio, we're going to divide that number by $5,000, which is our total monthly income. And when you divide the $2,300 by the $5,000, that gives you on your calculator, 0.46, which means your back-end debt ratio is 46%. So the borrower's debt ratios on this loan are going to be 35 over 46. And just remember, the back-end debt ratio includes all the borrower's payments for which they are obligated, including the housing payment. So far in our examples, we've oversimplified the monthly income, and I've just given it to you. Actually calculating what to use for the borrower's monthly income can be a little bit difficult. For commissioned or self-employed borrowers, you usually have to take a 2-year average of the commission or the self-employment income, and you'll usually have to look at the tax returns for that. So we're not going to get into those calculations, but we are going to talk about calculating monthly income amounts for borrowers who are paid monthly, borrowers who are paid every week, borrowers who are paid every 2 weeks, and then borrowers who are paid hourly. Now, you may have borrowers that are paid hourly every week, but when we talk about borrowers who are paid every week, we're going to talk about borrowers who are on salary every week, borrowers who are on salary monthly, borrowers who are on salary every 2 weeks, and then we're just going to talk about hourly borrowers separately. So let's start talking about our monthly borrowers. This is probably the easiest one of them all. If you have a borrower who receives $5,000 a month, you are going to use $5,000 a month income. Now we're going to make it slightly more complicated. Let's say you have a borrower who makes $100,000 a year. If you want to figure out his monthly income or her monthly income, all you do is divide the annual income by 12 to get your monthly income. So in this case, that's going to be 83, 33, and 33 cents. So salaried borrowers are fairly easy if you know a monthly amount or an annual amount. But they get a little bit more complicated if you're given a salaried borrower that's paid every week. So let's talk about that. Let's say a borrower is paid $1,000 every week. Now, some people may be tempted to just say, okay, if a borrower makes $1,000 every week, that means they make $4,000 every month. Hey, that's not entirely accurate, because if you notice, there are 52 weeks in the year. So if you take $1,000, multiply it by the 52 weeks of the year, because they are going to be paid every week, that's $52,000 a year. If you had done it the other way, you would have only given the borrower $48,000 a year in income. You've given the borrower $4,000 a year more in income doing it this way, which is going to allow them to qualify for more of a loan. So now that we have their annual income, you're just going to divide that by 12 in order to obtain their monthly income. In this case, that's going to be $43.33. And you notice that's $300 or $333 more per month by figuring it with 52 weeks in the year than if we had just taken $1,000 multiplied by 4 weeks out of the month. Our borrower that's paid a salary every 2 weeks is going to be very similar. So let's say we have a borrower that makes $3,000 every other week. They're going to receive 26 paychecks in a year, because if you just divide 52 weeks out of the year divided by 2, if they get paid every other week, that gives you 26 pay periods for that borrower per year. So to figure out their annual income, you take the $3,000, multiply that by 26, which gives you $78,000. And to get their monthly, you're just going to simply divide that by 12, which gives you $6,500 a month. Now you'll notice if we'd just taken the $3,000 that the borrower made and multiplied that by 2 because they get paid every other week, that would have only given them $6,000. The way we did it, by multiplying it by 26 and then dividing by 12, gives us $6,500 a month that we can use to qualify that borrower. The last method of payment we're going to discuss is hourly. Now, this does not involve complicated math, it just involves multiple steps. So let's talk about hourly. Let's assume our borrower makes $15 an hour. In order to calculate monthly income for a borrower who is paid hourly, we need to know how many hours a week they work. If they work full-time, underwriting guidelines say you can just use 40 hours a week, unless you know something different. So $15 an hour multiplied by 40 hours a week gives you $600 a week. And that just starts us where we were before. When we had a weekly income before, we multiplied that by 52. And if you multiply 600 by 52 on your calculator, that's going to give you $31,200 a year. And then to get our monthly amount, we're just going to divide that by 12. So when you divide that by 12, that gives you a monthly income amount of $2,600. Now, what if your borrower doesn't work full-time? Let's say you have a borrower who only works 30 hours a week. Same thing applies. You just need to, let's say, make $20 an hour, and they work 30 hours a week. So you take the $20 hourly rate, multiplied by 30, that's going to give them $600 a month in income, which that gives us the same number as we had over here. So it's going to end up with the same monthly income. But if you know that the borrower does not work 40 hours a week, you use the number of hours they actually work. Now, if the borrower makes more than 40 hours a week, you cannot just simply multiply their hourly rate by, for example, 45 hours. Those extra hours in excess of 40 hours are considered overtime. And most lending requirements require that you have at least 12 months, sometimes 2 years, of history in order to use the overtime. So typically, for a standard borrower, you're going to use 40 hours a week, and then if you can use overtime, you add that on top of that. Now let's review just a few examples of how you could use debt-to-income ratios in discussing with the borrower the loan amount for which they could qualify. Let's say a borrower comes to you and says they make $10,000 a month, and they want to know the payment for which they can qualify. Now you know that you're going to get them approved with a loan program that has a back-end debt ratio requirement only. And so that program says that the back-end debt ratio has to be equal to or less than 40%. And the program doesn't really worry about the front-end debt ratio. It only worries about the back-end. So your next question to the borrower then is regarding their month. So when you do that math calculation, that gives you $3,350 when you subtract the $650 away from the $4,000. That number right there, the $3,350, represents the maximum amount that the borrower can have in monthly housing obligation based on their income and their other credit or debt obligations. Now, to figure the actual loan amount, you need a financial calculator, and what you do is you'd stick that number in for your payment and then solve for your loan amount, and that would give you your maximum loan amount for the loan. Those calculations are beyond the scope of this course, but you do need to understand how to arrive at a maximum payment amount for a borrower based on the debt-to-income ratio requirements of the certain program, as well as the borrower's other debt obligations.